Somewhere in America, a phone is about to ring.
Welcome back to Shared Humanity. My name is Nelba Márquez-Greene, and in this podcast and video series, I speak to the humans behind the headlines of gun violence and gun violence prevention. In a moment in history where all too often we focus on everything but our shared humanity. Today's guests are Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox. Greg Jackson is a lived experience survivor of gun violence himself. He was the inaugural co-deputy director of the Office of White House Gun Violence Prevention. Previously, he had been executive director of the Community Justice Action Fund, which advances policies to address firearm injury and death in Black and Brown communities. He was an essential partner in crafting and the implementation of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, among many other accomplishments. Rob Wilcox is a lived experience survivor of the ravages of gun violence and also former co-deputy director of the Office of White House Gun Violence Prevention. Before stepping into that role, he worked as federal legal director for Everytown for Gun Safety, where he drew upon over 20 years of policy, advocacy, and litigation experience. He specialized in the development of comprehensive approaches to address gun violence and evidence-informed policy solutions. Rob also served a critical role in the development and establishment of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Together at the White House, as a priority of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, these two humans oversaw efforts to implement federal law, identify new executive actions, expand partnerships, and improve services for those traumatized by firearm injury and death. Thank you both for being here today. I think often when you are in this work, in the work of gun violence prevention, firearm injury prevention, people can fail to understand the weight and gravity of the task at hand. And it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for everyone. Greg, I noticed in our communication back and forth in preparation for this interview, your email signature reads, "Our lives begin to end when we become silent about what matters." Can you tell me what inspired you to get into this work and what inspires you to stay?
Yeah. Well, I've always been someone that wanted to fight for social change and equity in our communities. I grew up in rural Virginia and in a community that was really impoverished, but rural poverty is often overlooked and really kind of brushed under the rug. And so I came out of my childhood experience wanting to do more and moved into, went to college and came to DC wanting to join the political world and fight the power, and quickly found that government and policy moves really, really slow. And it's a hard road to get there. And so I actually spent my first few years out of college really working in campaigns in different spaces in politics. But my whole world really shattered in April of 2013 when I was caught in the crossfire of a shooting, and a bullet that struck two arteries, and left me in the hospital fighting for my life. And I came within 26 minutes of bleeding to death and had a 50-50 chance of surviving my first surgery. And as hard as that was, what was harder was how I was treated. When I arrived at the hospital, I was met with investigators instead of doctors, and I was questioned about my whereabouts and my role in the tragedy and the shooting, as opposed to being treated initially. And even when I came out of my surgery, I was looked at as really a suspect first and a person second. So that was hard. And then being someone who cared about politics and policy, turning on C-SPAN, and I was shot just 3 days after the Senate failed to pass universal background checks. And I watched political leaders and politicians, who many of which I had worked for, looked up to, make excuses of how they couldn't take action. And so that's what inspired me to really focus on this issue specifically, to dive into gun violence prevention, issue advocacy, and really fight to bring about a change in this issue and stop looking to others to be the change, but starting to focus on being that change myself.
And how about you, Rob? What inspired you?
I think what inspires me is both my personal experience with gun violence, but also all the survivors that I've met as being in this movement space for 20 years and kind of carrying their hope with me. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, between a couple of housing projects, and I saw violence growing up, but it wasn't until my cousin was shot and killed that I really started thinking about gun violence as its own issue. And I was a senior in college, and she was only 19. And just sitting here with you now, I can still remember being at her funeral and just how I'll never forget that feeling of seeing every adult in my family weeping and the sunlight coming in with the dust rising up and the music that was playing. It was a Quaker uh, event, and so in Quaker events, there's no kind of central figure. People kind of stand up when they're moved, and the whole community was there. They had to pack a whole middle school gymnasium talking about her, and I just thought what a beautiful bright light that I then wanted to stand in for in some respects. And so I moved to Washington D.C. then, and I kind of wanted to take over and share the story and make progress. And what I found instead was a town that really had no interest in gun violence prevention, no interest in truly addressing this issue. And sitting here with you today, I can tell you I remember the Washington Post story that the NRA said with the election of George W. Bush, they'll work out of the West Wing. I saw them pass dangerous policies like protections for negligent gun dealers and manufacturers. And it was discouraging, but I wasn't discouraged. And so I kind of decided to go off to law school and get some new skills. And, like Greg, I mean, the event tragedy that you went through, Nelba, was a moment that obviously moved so many people. And it was the moment that spurred me to kind of come back to this issue, actually. Because I was practicing law at this New York law firm. I'd had 2 kids at that point. I'd moved on. And I just remember watching and seeing, feeling the hope for a second of something was going to get done. And I found myself standing up off my couch and just moving close to the TV and so emotional because I'm not just thinking about what happened to you, but I'm thinking about my now 2 little kids and my cousin and what else could I be doing? And, I just was as discouraged as Greg. And it's one of these parallels. At the same time, both of us lean back into this issue and we kind of dedicate ourselves, I think, and we've been a team from even before this office to this issue, to making progress. We both believed in that progress. And all of a sudden, we passed the first significant gun safety law in 20 years, 30 years, right? All of a sudden, we have a White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, not an NRA-led office. And it was an office led by survivors and experts. And it gave us the opportunity. So what inspires me? What inspires me is not just the heartbreak of this issue, but it's the hope and the belief that we have the solutions to save lives.
I remember the whispers of the announcement, the whispers that a big announcement was coming, the whispers that people were going to lead this Office of White House Gun Violence Prevention. And you know how political this space is. And yet, universally, when your 2 names were mentioned, every single person who breathed your names, their shoulders relaxed a little bit, and they said, yes. Yes, these are the people. These are the people because they bring personal experience. They've been doing the work. They are trustworthy and they do it with integrity. And let me tell you how rare it is in our work. And I know you know this, that you say a name and everybody breathes a sigh. And I remember being like, well, who are they? And they're like, no, Nelba, they are amazing. This is going to be great. So my son and I get in a car and we drive down to this installation and there you are. And I get to meet these people being named. So I again, and I'm incredibly grateful for you being here. But I wanted to make sure you knew that from the moment your names were mentioned first to even when I am saying I'm gonna talk to them and I'm gonna have them on the box, you are still referred to as that. You are still, these are good men. So you have a reputation that precedes you. And with that, being in the White House, doing all the work you did, what would you say your most significant accomplishment was while you were there?
I mean, it's hard to pick any individual change. I think the most significant thing we did was we opened up the eyes of what's possible. We've talked about these solutions for a long time, all of us, and anyone who's listening who's been in this movement space, we've talked about lots of solutions to all types of aspects of this issue. But what we got to do with this office was show what it looks like when you actually put them in action, when you actually govern like a gun safety champion, which we know the president and vice president were. But what they did was create that structure where we could do it all. It wasn't just about one type of violence. It was about all of it. Domestic violence, community violence, mass shootings, suicide, accidents. And it wasn't just about one type of solution. It was about it all. Prevention and root causes, intervention for someone in crisis, making sure that they don't have access to guns, and we tackle gun trafficking, supporting the response work around solving homicides and getting the tools to shut down gun trafficking, ghost guns, but also the healing and recovery. And so I guess what I'm most proud of is that we really opened up our eyes to what's possible if you truly take an all-of-government approach and you really do lean in, not just to one aspect or one type, but the whole thing. And I think that to me, we never go back from, right? There's no more imagine. You don't have to imagine like what happens with an office or what does it look like if you truly take a public health approach and try to do it all. We know what it looks like. And now we can do that in states and cities, and we'll get a chance to do it again federally. But maybe Greg has a particular thing he's thinking of.
No, that was really good. I mean, I think if I was to throw an alternative idea out there, I think it's also just the people we empowered while we were in the White House. I know I was an advocate for 10 years, and the few times I was invited to the White House, I was just an observer in some fancy room, watching some speech or presentation, but I never felt like I had a seat at the table. But with this office, Rob and I really committed to bringing people to the table and not just having them there for ceremony, but really soaking up their ideas. Whether it was young teens that were impacted by community violence, whether it was, elders who have witnessed and been exposed to folks who've taken their own lives, to suicide, to we brought every teacher of the year in the country. We brought them to the White House to talk about gun violence. Like, you are the best of the best. You are the best teachers. What are you seeing? What can help? We brought together 60 health CEOs that oversaw 95% of our health system in the country and said, what are you doing? How are you attacking this issue? We brought together music producers, social media influencers, the leader of YouTube's content, and said, look, how can we crack down on some of these visuals that we know are harmful? And what we did is we just empowered so many individuals to play a bigger role, whether they have suffered loss, been impacted themselves, or were managing, multi-billion-dollar organizations that we know can play a role in this crisis. And each of them, and the vice president, we give her credit for this. She said, we don't meet to meet. What is the challenge? What is the action item? What is the takeaway? And we made sure we issued that challenge with every meeting. And there are so many more people part of this movement now, I think, because of this office. And they're not just speaking out or tweeting, but are finding their own unique ways to help solve this crisis.
The coalition building that you all did, the diversifying of the voices at the table was just something really beautiful and unique to see how you expanded the ecosystem of those responding to gun violence, both on the prevention side and those serving those impacted side. And that being said, I'm sure you meet with people who are deeply concerned now, because there is no longer a formal office of White House gun violence prevention. What do you say to them when they look at you and say, where do we go from here?
Well, Rob always says this, I'm going to steal his thunder for a second, but, the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention was never the destination. It was the vehicle. And what we were able to do with our time there was really create a playbook of what all can be done. And it's well documented. We've had multiple fact sheets, reports. We laid out our strategy. We're very transparent about it. But basically, we showed the world, here's what a Department of Education can do to help address school safety. Here's what a Department of Veterans Affairs can do to help deal with suicide amongst veterans. Here's what a Small Business Administration can do to help support communities after tragedy and to hold gun dealers accountable, right? Like, we looked at each component of government and even the philanthropic and private world and said, here's the way that you can play a role. And many of those policies are in action. Many of those campaigns are in action. Many of those resources and dollars are out the door. Over $40 billion went out the door under this administration that was never a part of the field of gun violence prevention. And so those resources are all at work. Those ideas are moving, and the playbook is now available. And now, regardless of what happens at the federal level, we can work with governors to implement that. We can work with mayors to implement that. We can work with corporations to implement that. We can work with influencers and individuals. And I think that's something we should all be proud of. And I think the other thing I would offer is that we did it all in a bipartisan way. And some of our biggest champions are Republicans, like Senator Collins in Maine, who was a part of our emergency response after the Lewiston tragedy and who sat next to me during the one year anniversary of that tragedy and thanked us and thanked our team, but also went to Newsweek and wrote an op-ed about how powerful the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is to keep our communities and our youth safe. And so we have champions on both sides of the aisle that I think should bring everyone confidence that even if this very short term is hostile, we think the long-term direction of gun violence prevention is something that both parties in all political backgrounds can be bought into.
At Yale, we are determined to look at firearm injury as a public health issue because that's what it is. And I know that your office worked closely with the Office of the former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, in order to make that declaration and educate the public on the number of different kinds of people who are in fact impacted by gun violence. It's not just those injured. It's not just those who lose family members. It is also witnesses who change behavior because they don't want to go outside. It's also people who have loved ones who have lost to suicide and so many other things. But the ability to study the problem is a key to public health. To implement and evaluate solutions, we need that data. The White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention leaned heavily on the use of good data, and we learned so many things, right? We learned that suicide is actually the largest population of death when it comes to firearm. We know that moms and siblings in the first year after a shooting are less likely to go and receive primary care. Knowing that and educating primary care physicians, that can only happen because we have study and because we have public health. What would you say are some of the most surprising things you were able to educate the public on? Because there's so many myths associated with gun violence, that everyone who is a victim is associated with a crime, that somehow you were wrong place, wrong time. And there's so many myths. There's so much discrimination. There is so much racism. You were able to educate the public. What would you say some of the most surprising facts were when you educated the public?
So I think there was a few big things that we were able to bring to light for folks. One is how important the kind of recovery and the healing, part of this issue is. Victim services, mental health, and truly investing in what is the fastest, the biggest way to become a disabled American is through gun violence. And the exposure to gun violence has devastating consequences in the short, medium, and long term, not just for parents, but for siblings. And as you said, Nelba, for those who've been witnessed violence or exposed to it on a regular basis. So I think centering the survivor needs as part of this issue was really essential for people to understand how devastating it is to be exposed to violence. And that's not just the kind of mental health effects. It's also, that is one of the big drivers of future acts of violence, is exposure to violence. I think switching gears, another really important thing we were able to do is show kind of where illegal guns come from. And I think part of that was when you go to the communities, and we did that a lot, you hear that people know about ghost guns, they know about Glock switches or auto sears, they know that there's handguns available, but they don't know exactly why and where, and are there solutions to do anything about it. And so we were able to educate that when we actually looked at every single gun trafficking investigation over 5 years, the biggest source for those illegal guns that were being investigated were unlicensed sellers, people selling guns at gun shows and online. And so, this big myth that Well, there's no such thing as, gun show loopholes and online sales loophole. The investigation shows quite clearly that these guns in our communities don't start there. They start somewhere far away, and they're starting with these unlicensed sellers. So we were able to take action through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to really address those loopholes and get at folks who are selling guns. I think another example is like, ghost guns and Glock switches. Like, we've heard a lot about those problems. And look, the old playbook was, well, these are illegal products, and if someone has one and they're prohibited from having it, we're going to crack down on that person. And very rarely were we like, well, how are these getting there in the first place? And look, what we find with ghost guns is that there was just one company, right? This one big company sold about 80% of these ghost guns. And what we did as an administration wasn't just focus on the individual, but focus on that source. And with regulation, we were able to shut down that market, and we're finally seeing a reduction in the ghost guns recovery. And I think people hear about that. They don't think that ghost guns are being produced by a company that's profiting, right? They think that, kids are making these and they are just kind of showing up, but it's really being driven by a company that's operating outside the law. And the last example I'll give is these Glock switches. I think it's a really pressing one. Probably one of the biggest issues we hear about, both from community and from law enforcement. Together, they say these Glock switches, these auto sears, are one of the most biggest threats because they allow, 100 bullets to be shot in under a minute. And so when we did an executive order, the president signed an executive order trying to engage on this issue of emerging threats, figure out, where they're coming from. And so we ran a multi-agency task force. And what you find out is that, like anything, these don't just show up. They actually come from two places. One, you can go online. You could have gone online and you Google auto sear and you end up on websites that look just like Amazon, right? They look like surface websites, and you order these parts. And through our work, what we find out is that those all got traced back to China, and they're being shipped in 50, 60 at a time. So what we did is we actually shut down 350 websites that were selling these products. The second thing we found out is that they get 3D printed. And everyone used to say, well, there's nothing we could do about this. But instead, we leaned in as an administration, and we're funding solutions that have the potential to interrupt the 3D printing by getting between the design and the 3D printer and actually stop that 3D printing. And those kind of solutions are where we need to keep focusing, keep investing. And maybe we don't have an ally in the federal government right now who's going to push. But that doesn't mean we as a movement, we as philanthropies, we as states don't lean in to these vitally important upstream solutions.
Yeah. I'll just add too, the couple other big things that we were able to educate the public on was just the severity of this issue. The fact that 54% of Americans have experienced a firearm related incident, that this is the leading cause of death for youth in America, but it's also the leading cause of newly disabled Americans. It's also a leading cause of death for pregnant women in America, surpassing childbirth complications. And this is a very intensely and uniquely an American problem. And that is a direct correlation to the number of firearms, in addition to the mental health crisis we're in. But that's the really big difference. We know that countries all over the world are struggling with poverty, with mental health challenges, with trauma from the pandemic. But the big difference is literally the number of firearms we have. Over 400 million guns in our country, more guns than people, 4 times the number of guns we had in the 90s. We had the last big spike in violent crime. And so that is just huge to shine a light on, and also to make sure people see the reality of who's being impacted. Only 1% of gun-related deaths are school shootings. But what we are seeing is that it is definitely the number one cause of death for youth, but a lot of that is interpersonal violence amongst youth and teens. And when we look at suicide, the group that's being impacted most intensely are elder white men. And that is being overlooked. And I think what we have allowed is that the media has kind of sensationalized gun violence in our country and made it feel really intense to certain groups, when in reality it's impacting all of us. Whether you're in rural South Dakota or south side of Chicago, you are almost equally at risk of a gun-related death. It just shows up in different forms. And so that was a part of what we were able to lay out, and then also push people to think about solutions beyond just crime reduction strategies, recognizing that at this point, crime is only connected to maybe 15, 20% of all gun-related deaths. And so we have to take a health approach, or even the best crime-based strategy won't even address a third of the deaths that we're seeing.
It is to walk around in the body of a bereaved parent is burden enough. To walk around in the body of a bereaved parent, knowing that how your child was killed is almost a carve-out exemption versus the empathy given to other families actually is an additional burden. So my question, although I asked it not in the most artful way, is empathy drives resources. So if we can use that data to dispel the myths, to increase the empathy because maybe our situations aren't what unite us. Maybe you lost your person in a shooting on a street corner and I did not. However, the impact of the death, of the injury will be the same, right? The mental health consequences, the physical health consequences, and it is a constant 24/7 relentless job and sense of urgency I have to remind people to care. And I know that is something that you held holy at the Office of White House Gun Violence Prevention. This is why you should care, not just for some people, but for everyone. And I'm sure you held stories. I'm sure you went to different places. I'm sure you sat with grieving people. I'm sure you went to communities. And of all of the stories, are there any that stay with you that you could share as a reminder to us why this matters?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's so many. I think one that stuck with me is before I took this job, I lost one of my mentees, Karan Brown, who was shot and killed. And while I was at the White House, his youngest brother was shot and killed. And I went to visit his mother, and she was in the same apartment building, same financial situation, had not received trauma care or support. No one from the city, state, or federal government had even called or mentioned or even reached out to her. And she had lost two of her children. She had to put two of her children in the same graveyard. And the fact that I was the one to go there, considering all the layers that exist that should be supporting our Americans and our mothers, our neighbors, it was tragic. And it's just a reminder to me that there are these big moments that will get all this media attention and the world will revolve around it. But every day there are people that are falling through the cracks and are not getting the resources and support. And I carry that with me every day. It's like Rob and I, we worked harder when there wasn't something on the news because we knew that, okay, there's something terrible happening every day. Someone's experiencing this trauma that we experience every day. But hell, we can outwork it if we're grinding every day. But unfortunately, there were so many different stories, and there is no stereotype for a victim of gun violence, whether it's a 70-year-old veteran who lost his son, or a single mother, Latina mother. The trauma shows up the same, even if they have these very different walks of life. And unfortunately, from our vantage point, we saw all of it, and we saw how it intensely destroys families regardless of their background or their class or their race. So it was hard.
Yes, yes. And if there are people listening who are like, okay, I get it, I'm on board, I at an individual level would like to be involved. I hear that question all the time. Nelba, I'm moved. I just don't know where to start. Where would a regular person begin?
Yeah. There's a lot that could be done. Sorry, Rob, you want to go first? Okay, there's a lot. So look, we know that criminal activity is not necessarily the thread between violent situations, but what we have found is trauma is a very clear thread. So someone who has acted out or lashed out or committed an act of violence, more than likely they've been traumatized or impacted by violence or exposed to violence first. So a big thing that we all can be a part of is supporting people after an act of trauma, after they've been impacted. And it might not just be the person who's injured or suffered loss. It might be their little brother, their best friend, that person you see crying in the corner at a funeral home, the one who can't even show up, even though they were buddies for 10 years, right? We have to figure out how to invest and support victims and survivors of violence at a much greater scale to interrupt the cycle of violence. We also know that, especially with youth violence, the guns are coming from very predictable places. 76% of school shootings, the guns come from the home. 80% of youth suicide, the guns come from the home. 76% of accidental harm, the guns come from the home. So one easy thing that anyone can do is help us push the message of safe storage. And by starting with you first, are you securely storing your firearm? Is it locked? Is it separated away from your ammunition? Are your neighbors moving the same way? Are your friends moving the same way? Are your parents moving the same way? And what we found is that most Americans are not doing a good job. And that's why so many of these situations are happening. It's not always the boogeyman with a van in an alley. A lot of these firearms are coming out of nightstands and cupboards and closets and under pillows and winding up in schools and at playgrounds and at house parties. So that's a second huge thing that we can do that anyone can play a role in, regardless of politics. And then lastly, there are so many organizations that are working on this issue, whether they're doing violence intervention, working with at-risk youth, whether they're supporting elderly that are in crisis. And those organizations, almost all of them need more support. And so you don't have to go all the way to Washington. You can look right in New Haven or right in Detroit or right in, El Paso and find that organization and figure out how you can be a best support to them because they're desperately in need. And AmeriCorps actually supports many of these groups. There's 500 of them through AmeriCorps alone. So if you can't find it on your own, you can simply support your local AmeriCorps site, and likely you will find a group that's working on violence prevention. But those are three big things you can do before we even talk about policy and politics and advocacy. So, Rob?
Those are good, and I completely agree. I think the other thing that we could all do is we need to ask our governments to not just solve yesterday's crime of gun violence, but to solve today and tomorrow's public health crisis. And that means they need to be building a structure of government that doesn't look like yesterday's, but looks like today's, right? Where have you prioritized your city or your state or your county office of violence prevention? Who's staffing it? What are you doing, right? I think it's very important that we really rebuild government. If this is a public health crisis, I'll say no, but like you said, well, then how are we rebuilding government to tackle that? And I think that's really important because the work that we did across agencies was because we were sitting close to the president, right? We were one step removed. We had the authority to kind of convene and collaborate across, and we had kind of some expertise. And I think that's just really important for all of our leaders to be thinking about how are they changing government to actually address this as a public health crisis. So it's not just up to your law enforcement or your Department of Public Safety, your Department of Justice, well, your Department of Labor and your Department of Education and your health department. How are they all working together to do their part? And so, I know, look, we're not going to have an office like this in Washington for 4 years, but that doesn't mean we don't have these offices at our state level, and our city level, and that we're not really, fighting for this new reimagination of how to address this issue.
It's just so important because I think alongside the other mythologies is this mythology that, everyone who is a part of this is going to go be an advocate and they're going to get stronger and they're going to run for office and they're going to do this. And sometimes that happens. Other times people just get weaker and they become more isolated from community and they don't have their supports that they need in order to come out on the other side. And with public health, we can do both those things. We can work on the prevention side and we can do the examination of the structures and supports needed to make communities more whole, which I am deeply committed to. I want to thank you both for being with us today. Is there anything that if you could share with folks at Yale who are listening, students across the campus and outside, that you would want them to know about your work, about the two of you? What would you say?
Well, I think we can't end without saying the kind of the most important thing, I think, to me and Greg, is that it's not just the policy change. It's not just the people we brought in and empowered. It's the fact that over the past year and a half, we've seen the biggest reduction in gun violence in this nation's history. Right? And no one's thinking about that, right? We've been desensitized to think that there's violence everywhere and we don't have solutions that work. In 2023, we saw what was then the biggest drop in homicide, nearly 12%. This year, we're looking at nearly a 16% reduction. Cities like Boston, right? Big city, right? You think about that, you're like, oh, it's a big city, and heard the stories. They had 24 homicides in 2024. The city of Philadelphia saw a nearly 50% reduction. The city of Baltimore saw reductions 40%. The city of Detroit has seen fewer homicides than in 50 years. We have to talk about, not that the work is over, but that these solutions, when we put them in place, lead to people being alive. And we don't need to talk about it in terms of data points and kind of charts and graphs. Those are important, but it's literally about the lives that we've saved. And it's the difference between going to a birthday party or a funeral. And that is so consequential to this work. And it's so invaluable for folks to know, is that we are reducing violence and we have the solutions that work. We just need to go put them in place.
Yeah. And I want to just really hammer on that last piece. You know, this administration passed the first law in 30 years, which had major policy changes and $15 billion in it. We moved $15 billion of COVID relief into violence prevention programs. We executed 54 presidential actions, which that we can have a whole podcast just going through each of them. We have an episode per presidential action. Everything from using Medicaid to address violence, to cracking down on ghost guns, Glock switches, to enhancing our data, creating labor programs that can provide more resources for communities that are suffering with poverty and violence, providing more resources for trauma. Again, it can go on and on. But 54 presidential actions, and in total, around $42 billion were moved into gun violence prevention. And all of that happened under this administration. Rob and I were honored to be a big part of expediting the use of those resources and getting that out the door. And thankfully, we did that before this administration. And there's real results to stand on. 12% reduction in 2023, between a 13 and 17% reduction in 2024. And those reductions are double what we've seen in American history. And so this is not a stat sheet. This is not a spreadsheet or campaign commercial. We know these are real lives. These are real people who are coming home to their children, to their neighbors, to their mothers, to their friends, to their basketball courts, to their classrooms, to their senior citizen homes, to their whatever. These are real folks who are living healthy lives and have an opportunity to live out their dreams. And that's a result of real policy and real change. And so that's what I am most proud of. And I think for anyone who has been either traumatized or discouraged by this issue, what we've been able to do over the last few years is show that there is a way to turn a corner on this, and we can end gun violence. If we're reducing it double digits 2 years in a row, imagine if we had 10 years in a row. This will be rare and not something that we think about every day and experience every day. And so I'm just so thankful we have that playbook, and I'm so thankful that President Biden had the vision and leadership to invest in these strategies, to pass this law, to sign it, to build this team, and really show our country that we will not be defeated by gun violence. And the fight may be longer than we think, but we know we can win it.
And we have local change here that happened as a result of that fight. We have a state office of gun violence prevention. Our hospital violence intervention programs are stronger and more effective. Our community-based organizations, Compass Youth Collaborative, Hartford Communities That Care, are all stronger and better and receiving dollars from the state that come from. So it is part of the work, and now we focus in a different direction, but we are incredibly grateful to both of you for serving as co-deputy directors of this office, and the former administration for leading in this way. We know this isn't the last we're going to hear from you. We could have spent a year on executive actions. My bent is empathy, and empathy for all communities that are impacted by gun violence. It is just so incredibly important to me that we go counterculture, counter media, not just with what we see there, but look for those families, those individuals that are not being served, and go there, because that is where we begin. Thank you both so much for spending time with us, and we will check in again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
May this podcast give you new perspective and empower you to hope and action. I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox. Thank you for listening. Shared Humanity is produced by the Yale School of Public Health. Follow us on social media at Yale SPH and learn more at sph.yale.edu/shared humanity. Thank you to the Yale Porvu Center and Yale Broadcast Studio for their support.
Somewhere in America, a phone is about to ring.